Hello and welcome back to When Sunday Comes, a podcast that aims to get into the heart of women's football and hosted by myself, Graham Falk. This week's guest is one of the most well-known and well-loved defenders in the whole of the WSL and someone who has fought adversity more than once and is currently on the comeback trail for title chasing at Manchester United. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to the show Aoife Mannion. Aoife, how are you? Are you all right?
Well, thanks for that introduction. I was like, who's this? And then you said my name. Thanks for having me on. I'm really looking forward to chatting.
We always start with the same question, right? It's approximately 4:15, 4:30 on the 25th of January, 2023. How's your day been? What have you been up to?
So we've been in training today. It's a Wednesday. And what that means is when we have a game on a Sunday, Wednesday is our hardest day in training. So we had a really big pitch session. And then after that, we were in the gym as well. We've just had a few new signings. So one of the girls called Lisa, it was her first day. She's a Norwegian girl. So there's a few fresh faces and United is quite an exciting place to be at the moment. So today's went well, thanks.
Obviously, onto you, at the time of speaking, you made your long way to come back on a trip to Malta. You may have made your league comeback by the point this comes out. But as we're speaking at the moment, your comeback was in Malta. How big of a moment was that for you? People, I think, know the history, which we'll go deeper into, but how big was that for you?
It was a really big moment for me, and it was quite a strange circumstance because we were obviously on a winter mid-season training camp in Malta, which is just an absolutely gorgeous country, by the way. I'd not been before, and so it almost had a little bit of a holiday vibe, just purely from the weather, which was such an abrupt change from what we're used to in Manchester. So that combined with knowing that I was going to be able to be involved in the friendly was just really exciting. And I was quite surprised that I didn't get overly nervous. But I've been through this process before with like a long-term ACL injury. And I can tell you that last time it was really overwhelming when I first came back onto the pitch. Whereas this time it almost didn't feel anticlimactic, but I guess because I've done it before, it sort of, I knew what to expect and I just felt really comfortable. And I managed to get the first 45 minutes of that friendly match against a team called Buccara over in Malta. So all around, it was a really, really good day. And then to top it off, when we got back to the hotel, the team had spoken to the hotel and then put on a really nice cake for me and sort of wrote my name on the cake. And we all had a sort of a really tiny bit of champagne in a champagne glass. Obviously, a lot of the girls don't drink. So it was more there just to kind of recognise my journey, which was such a nice touch. So I was probably more emotional about that than actually playing the game. Who would have thought that I'd be more pleased for the cake in the evening? But overall, it was a really nice camp, and it kind of marked me coming back from my injury that's obviously dominated all of my time since last February 2022.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you've experienced this type of injury before, which is interesting. I've had a few guests on the show, and unfortunately, you've suffered ACL injuries. But how hard is it to suffer an injury of that type the second time? And how hard is that recovery period the second time around in comparison to the first? Is it easier? Is it harder? How is it different?
It's definitely different. And not all ACL injuries are the same. So when we hear ACL, obviously that's, an injury that's involved an ACL. So that ligament, that's what dominates the conversation. But the first time around, when I did it a few years back, I did various other things. It's actually quite a lot more of a significant injury than the one that I did last February, even though they both have the same names, being an ACL injury. So the physical side of the rehab has been so much smoother this time round. It's been totally night and day, almost as though it was two different injuries. Bizarrely, I didn't really get any setbacks this time round. In fact, I didn't get any setbacks, which is almost unheard of. And I mean, I can only say that that's because I got a bit lucky. The physio had a really, really clear plan of what the journey was going to look like for me, and also my initial injury wasn't as dramatic as some other people's are. So I sort of took that look and ran with it a little bit. But in terms of the emotional side, obviously doing an ACL for the second time, those first, I would say, couple of months were really quite difficult to sort of accept that I'd gone through this reality before, and I think it had taken 15 months the first time round, and sort of reckoning with the idea that was going to be what was in store for me again. And once I'd actually accepted that and sort of settled into the reality, things kind of got a lot easier then. And it was actually quite sort of not mundane, but the sort of day-to-day reality of having that injury was not boring, but the emotional roller coaster wasn't there in the way that it was in the first ACL. And so I suppose that goes to show that a lot of our experience of those long-term injuries are very, very subjective and very circumstantial, based on if we've had it before or what else is going on, or how we relate to football as our career, and how much of our own identity we place on being a footballer. And because I'd had that experience before of having to spend time on the sidelines where I couldn't call myself a footballer, it was just slightly easier to swallow the second time. So in a long-winded way of answering your original question of what was it like the second time, it's been different in different ways, and not necessarily in the ways that I'd expected it to.
Really interesting that you picked up and said, when you had the injury, I couldn't call myself a footballer. I've heard that before, because from my perspective, even when you're injured, I'd 100% call you a footballer, because that's what you are. But that shows maybe the mental aspect of it, the amount of time that you have out of the game when it comes to that sort of injury. I think someone said to me once that they felt like they'd lost their, not persona, like they'd lost their, I can't think of the word necessarily, but they didn't feel like they were doing their profession when they had it, even though technically you're just going through a period of time where you can't physically play it. But does that play in your mind as well, that then, the sort of element of like feeling that you're not a footballer because you've been out for that long?
Well, I guess firstly, for at least 5 months, you literally don't kick a ball. You're in a gym, doing various movements, trying to get your muscles strong. And so not only are you not playing professionally at the weekend with your team, you're also not kicking a ball about with your mates in the park. So the experience of being an injured player is quite an extreme one, because obviously the recovery from the surgery is quite a big surgery to have in those first few months afterwards. And then in terms of like, do you feel sort of as though you've lost your career or you've lost your profession a bit? Yeah, I guess you do, but more so from the routine. Your routine changes so much. You go from being part of a big group of 20 to 25 people to then sort of it being me, myself and I and the physio in the gym. And we were really lucky actually at United in that when I was rehabbing, there wasn't many other injuries. Obviously, that's a really good thing for the team. But what it did mean for me is that, that meant that it was an even more isolated experience, in the sense that you don't get that same sense of team. So I guess in that way of describing it, yes, it is really, really different from the experience of being a professional footballer, even though that is obviously what we still are.
It's frustrating watching on. Totally get that 100%. You're going to be able to add to it in the second part of the season. But Man United have been in great form, top of the league at the time of speaking, which is, I was going to say unheard of, but it's not really. But at the same time, it's probably maybe even ahead of schedule, maybe where they expect to be. But what do you put United's great form down to? Obviously, you're in and around the girls. The spirit seems great. There's loads of friendships that blossom there. You seem like a real team. What do you really put it down to, though? The fact that you are top at the time of speaking.
It's interesting that you've made mention that we're top of the table. And I think it was my mum on the phone to me that had mentioned it yesterday as well. And as a team, none of us have mentioned that. No one has actually referenced that fact of where we are in the league table, not because we don't think it's important, or not because the prospect of being at the top wouldn't really excite us, but we're so in the trenches of the day-to-day running of trying to perform at the weekend, and then what that means for our training sessions. And so when I guess you ask questions like that, and it kind of pulls me into more of a perspective moment, it feels quite strange, because I'm right in the thick of it. I think there's so many reasons why we're doing well. So many reasons, and the most obvious ones are we have really, really good players. So, you know, think of the Lionesses that won the Euros. They're literally, just to name a few. And obviously Mark came in at the start of last year, and it's probably taken a while for those ideas to really start to shine through onto the pitch. And I believe that that's probably what's starting to happen. And then another thing is just that we have been fortunate enough to be on a really good run of form. And as with the good side of form and good momentum, things can switch and things can pivot. And very rarely will a team go through the season always having had the best form or always having had really good momentum. At the time of speaking, we played Reading a few days ago, and we narrowly beat them in the last few minutes of a game, and it ended up 1-0 in our favour. When we did the video analysis today, you know, we're totally locked in on all of the analysis where we should have been doing better. And so, although potentially from the outside looking in, we look like we're in a really good place, it sounds very cliche, but we're really not taking that for granted. It really is. Every day we're working on particular things, and we know that there's any team in this league that could turn up on a day and really, really give a performance that pushes us right to the line. And so, even though we're on a really good form, I do think that, yeah, I've never been I've never felt in an environment where we've not referenced that outside perspective like I am at United now. We're not talking about the league. We're just literally getting that feel of what things look like week to week.
And you yourself, obviously, you've seen how well the team's playing. You see where you're at. You're concentrating that game to game. You're due to come back. By the time this goes out, you might have even been on the field, because obviously there's a weekend to come and stuff like that. In reference to you yourself, is there added excitement that, A, the fact that the team's doing really, really well, and B, that you can add to it in the second part of the season because you're now back and on the road to full fitness?
Yeah, there's definitely an excitement for me to be involved on the pitch. So far, I've just done that in the mid-season friendly we had over in Malta, and I was on the bench for the first time against Reading a couple of days ago. And so, for me personally, I don't know what the next few months are going to look like or are going to hold for me, and that's really exciting. What I do know is that I'm so keen to kind of get back into the swing of things in training, and be as useful as I can be to the girls. I love being around this group of girls. I think probably the togetherness shines through, and it's quite clear, I think, from the outside that this is a team that's quite close, which again is really quite special. And so for me to be able to be involved in that in a more substantial way than, let's say, when I was rehabbing, was quite exciting.
In reference to Man United, I want to have a couple more questions. There's one player that I will openly admit I think is a fantastic player, and in my opinion, the best right back in Europe. There'll be some people that disagree with me, but that's fine. But you work with her every day. Anna Batlle is obviously someone you've played alongside, and her reputation is continuously growing. From someone who works alongside her every single day and have done for quite a while now, how far can she go?
For Anna, the sky is the limit, really. She's improved so much, even in the time that I've known her, which is the start of last season. And even then, she would often be the star of the show at the weekend. So it's not that when I started to get to know her at United, she was kind of a up and coming player. She was always cemented in her role and her position and what she adds to the team. And so to think that she's taken her game even a few notches higher in such a short space of time is a testament to her, really. In particular, we played a game a couple of weeks ago against Liverpool, and I think she assisted 3 of the goals. She's a woman on a mission. She knows exactly what she's about, and there's many things that she does that she would say is kind of unique to how she wants to improve as a footballer. She you'll always catch her doing extras at the end of training, doing sort of adding bits to her game which you might not see for another few months, which is quite weird, really. So when I think of her putting crosses into the box, that's something that she's really added to her game in recent months. But she's been developing that for as long as I've known her, and so I think she's quite forward thinking and progressive in that she's always trying to become better, and players like that are infectious, and it's people like her that are definitely one of the reasons that we're doing so well.
I think another player as well I want to touch on, and mainly because she plays in your exact position. You've yet to play alongside her as yet. Sure you will do shortly. She's had her Lionesses debut this season. She's been outstanding for Manchester United since she's arrived at the club. Myla Tissier has probably been one of the standout younger players across the WSL season so far, and a big reason United have done so well and look so strong defensively. But how far do you think she can go at United and Lionesses level? Obviously, as someone who still only 27, but you're vastly experienced and you can see what she's bringing at the age of 20, 21. How far can she go?
Maya can go as far as she wants to go. She is definitely one of the hottest young prospects at the moment in the WSL. She had a really interesting journey into women's football. So she's from Guernsey, and she basically played for the local boys team over there from most of her sort of youth career side of things. And then eventually took a plunge, I think, when she was about 16 and came over, and only then started to integrate properly into girls and women's football. And so knowing her as a person, she's one of the criticisms that I sometimes have of being involved in an academy team is that you can very easily become sort of like a merge into everyone else. You can lose that identity of you as an individual character. And even though some of the academies are absolutely incredible, sometimes I think, okay, what is this player going to do to take the initiative to differentiate themselves and improve themselves in a way that's unique to them? And that is a problem that Maya will never, ever have. This girl, like Anna, is another girl that is absolutely on a mission. She just seems to be like a total pocket rocket of energy in terms of her attitude and appetite for the day. And you see it every day at training. And so when she puts in good performances at the weekend, it's never any surprise. She's practicing all of the boring things that probably will never make it into a highlights reel, but she is really working on the basics and adding little things into a game, much like Anna as well. And we were talking about her a moment ago.
In terms of one thing I do have to ask, because if I don't, I'm going to get shot by them. Man United have a very vocal and passionate fan base, and probably one of the biggest, most passionate fan base I've come across in WSL, which is great. I love it. But how much have you enjoyed as a player playing in front of them? Because you can hear them wherever you go. They've got their own away ends now. Like I say, one of the most passionate in the league. It must be amazing to play in front of. But what's your experience been like with them?
The fans at United are second to none. I've not come across a fan base like that so far in my career. We played Reading a couple of days ago, and you would think that it was a United home game. That's how they made it feel. And if I'm being honest, even if there was 3 United supporters there, it probably still would have felt like that because of how passionate and vocal they are. They demand so much. The fans do everything to such an excessive degree. They will love you harder than any other fan base. They will turn up in volumes and numbers more than any other fan base. When they think that the standards needs to be higher, they will let you know more than any other fan base. And so we are really aware as players that we need to match their standards and give them something to sort of shout about, really. They travel so well in away numbers. Probably the amount of fans that we had at the Reading game a few days ago, so United fans, away travelling fans, it's probably more than some clubs in the WSL get as a home fan base. And so it's kind of, it's almost like it's like separate to I think the experience of being a United footballer or a United fan is its own thing. It's almost separate to probably most of the clubs in the league. And that is just a testament to the supporters, really.
Yeah, they're fantastic. I can't knock them in any way, shape, size, or form. Now we're going to revert all the way back to not the most recent stuff, the older stuff that we can go back to. So, born in Solihull, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
1995. So a little bit younger than me.
Yeah.
I'm getting on. Really long question, a really short question to ask with a really long answer, probably. But what was your earliest and most vivid memories of A, loving football, B, playing football?
There's pictures of me when I'm only slightly older than a baby, holding like a football that's bigger than my head. So interestingly, I don't have any other older brothers or sisters. My parents weren't particularly pushy about sports, and so it seems to be something that I was just drawn to. My first memories are sort of booting the ball about in the garden, and then football was the social currency at school with all the boys, and so I'm probably the thing that underlines me and my experience of a footballer and how I connect to it is that I'm really competitive, and so games where you can win or lose, that has always been something that I just find so exciting. I just can't help myself, and so the idea of joining in with the football at school break and trying to win rather than lose is just something that I couldn't understand back then, why other people wouldn't be sort of absolutely excited by that. And then I guess I just took that energy and ran with it. Eventually joined a little boys team. I think it was like an under 17. Played with them for a few years, and then entered into sort of the world of girls football, because at that time I think under 11 or under 12 was the cut-off time when you had to start playing with the girls. But really throughout everything, it's more been about the competition than the skill or the technique. And certainly as I've got older, and the competition for places has got even more competitive, I've had to lean into that area of football a lot more. So developing skills and techniques and vision and tactics and passing and everything like that. Something that I would never be accused of was someone else wanting to win in that game more than me on a given moment.
It's funny you mentioned about the competitive nature being the thing that draws you to the game, because I read, so when I was looking over your career this morning, that the players you looked up to were Robbie Savage and Roy Keane, two players who, shall we say, are slightly competitive, especially Roy. He's still competitive, I think. I remember him as a manager at my football club, Sunderland. Obviously, everyone remembers him as a player, but were they the kind of players you gravitated to when you were younger?
Yeah, they definitely were, simply because they were the epitome of what I was, trying to be on the pitch. And when I went to watch games with my dad in the men's stadiums, it was those sorts of players that were sort of throwing their body around, seemed to be really aggressive. Those are the ones that I'm just most aligned with naturally. And I guess they tended to be players that worked down the spine of the pitch. Perhaps were, really leaning into the physicality of the game. And so still to this day, Roy Keane is definitely an idol for me.
Yeah, me too, to be fair. When it comes to you first getting into football and teams, as you said, you sort of got into it when was it under sevens, I think you were saying. But correct me if I'm wrong, you first started in terms of like actual teams was like Birmingham City's academy around under 10, under 11, is that correct?
Yeah.
And I'm assuming Birmingham were your club as a team that you supported growing up?
Yes, yeah, definitely.
What were your sort of memories of that? Because you see, I don't have this perspective as a fan. I just loved Sunderland when I was 5-year-old, and I still love Sunderland at 36, but I've never had the chance to put the shirt on unless it's going to the match to support the team. At 10, you're still learning so much stuff about life. You're still learning about it at this age. But what was that like when you were like 10, 11, and you put on that Birmingham shirt and you think, well, hang on a minute, I've actually got a chance of representing the club that, I've grown up with and the club that I love. Like, that must be quite surreal for like a 10, 11-year-old Aoife.
It was really surreal. And then actually, when I think back to it as well, the shirts that the girls wore and the women's team wore were completely different to the men's shirts. And so even though on name, I was playing for Birmingham City, the academy at the time, actually, there was very, very little integration into the men's side of things. And obviously at that time, football was in a space where the whole experience of football was dominated by the men's side, and obviously that is starting to change now, and the women's side of the game is getting much more attention. But I think when I look back, I probably wasn't as proud of it as I would have been if I was a kid now. Not that I wasn't proud of it, but what would have made it feel even more special was that if it was even more integrated with the men's team. And so when you pose to me that question, I probably can't really remember thinking, oh, this is so amazing because I'm playing for Blues. And also sort of saying that you're a girls footballer wasn't necessarily the most popular thing. It wasn't the thing that everyone wanted to do, like be a girls footballer per se. And so there was some bits around that kind of affected how much I really leaned into the image of it. Obviously, I loved the game and I played it as hard as I could, but in terms of showing it off to, I don't know, the kids at secondary school, I didn't play in at lunchtime or at the breaks at secondary school. I was very much kind of trying to, fit in the best I could. I mean, that still didn't do that good of a job of it. But yeah, I didn't really want to wave the flag of being a girls footballer that much, which I guess is really sad looking back. And I'm so glad that these days things are in a place where it's actually quite cool, that's more surreal to me, that girls football is getting to be a really cool thing now.
Yeah, no, it's definitely changed. I was going to say, it is kind of almost sad when you're saying that, because I think one big thing for me, I went to see Sunderland Birmingham of all teams at the Stadium of Light. They did a double header, and there was actually a young boy, must have been 6 or 7, and he had a girl's name on the back of his shirt. And
that's really cool.
We sometimes think about obviously the girls, and obviously that's really important that they're feeling encouraged and they see a career and stuff like that, But it's really cool that the little boy had a female footballer as a hero as well. But it's crazy how much things have changed. But obviously we've talked about Birmingham a little bit. You went Aston Villa, yes, very young age, but your first real experience of first team football is where you really came to prominence originally. Obviously Birmingham, a club close to your heart because that's the club you supported. I'll be honest, I could never sign for Newcastle. I'm not good enough, but I could never sign for them. So what was it that made you decide Villa was the best option for you at that point? What was the attraction of Villa in terms of you as a professional footballer, maybe away from being a fan?
I think something that we sometimes, it can be hard to see from the outside, is that even though the men's side of a team might be really successful, there might be a massive variance in what's on offer for the women's team. And so when I went to Villa at the academy level, it was simply because the organisation and structure just wasn't there at Blues, which is obviously my first love. I remember little things like Mum didn't always know what the venue was that we were going to be playing at the weekend. So there was like little logistical things that made the experience probably a bit harder than would have been ideal. And I had other friends at Villa, and I just didn't, to be honest, I didn't really, I didn't think that it would be so significant for people when they look at the story of my career. And I'm surprised how much I get asked about it, because I do. And also more recently, I get asked so much about the move from City to United. And when I was making these steps through my career, to me, there was always like a fairly simple reason that felt quite self-explanatory, but actually from the outside looking in, hardcore football fans sometimes find that really find it really hard to get their head around. And a big one was when I went back to Birmingham from Villa. Villa were a completely amateur side. Villa ladies, they were called, not Villa women at the time. And Birmingham offered the promise of being in the bigger league. Obviously, that's the team that I support, and potentially a career. But when people look back, they find it hard to think that that actually there would be so much variance. So, for example, when I first signed for City, I think that was the year that United women's team got created. Like, that's absolutely bizarre. The United women's team have only been alive for 4 or 5 years, right? And so not that any of those reasons or excuses will change how people feel about me going from sort of one enemy line to the other. But all I can say is that those were the types of things that I was thinking about when I did move. And I fully expect the sort of interest and criticism as well that comes with that. One thing that I would say is that you could never go from United to City. That is something that I definitely feel.
Mm-hmm.
But for someone who already from the outside might be seen as a turncoat, well, my words won't necessarily take that much stock with some people, but I would definitely say that.
It's interesting that you sort of mentioned that, because you'll notice I didn't mention it within the Manchester United questions, which I was tempted by, but I think I was kind of interested in how my mindset was when I was like 16, 17, and I was so like that sort of staunch, loyal football fan that I was wondering what the perspective would be like. If anything, I think it's quite respectful to be able to have the bravery to make that move. In many ways, I think when you're younger, you kind of think...
women's football just wasn't that deep 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it just wasn't, it wasn't like Villa women weren't in the top league. It was completely amateur, and a team that I really liked wanted me to go there, and they were in a higher league and you could make a career out of it. I think when football fans think of going from one team to another, they think of them both on like completely the same level. Like, you've got to imagine Villa women were training in the evening like twice a week. So it's like just these little things. It's even hard for me to remember that the experience was so different being involved in women's football, even probably just 10 years ago. Sometimes I have to remind myself, but I guess for as long as I'm still getting asked questions about football, people will be interested in the fact that I've changed from teams, and I don't have a great answer to come back with it, and it's not really something that I think about too much, really.
I think you've answered it really well. But obviously from the move that you went back to Birmingham, you signed for David Parker, I believe, at the time.
Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but was your debut in the Champions League?
I think it might have been, but I can't fully remember. I think it was like 2013.
Yeah, it was. That's right. And obviously you had so much time at Birmingham. There's so many good memories. And obviously that's where you really kind of got lots of your sort of experience when you're younger growing up. We touched on before about what it's like wearing the shirt of the club that you support and you love and stuff like that. And I may be going back to a question I've asked already in many ways, but you're obviously in the Champions League at that point with Birmingham. There's loads of good stuff that was to come. But what was that like going back to the club that you support? Obviously, at the time, a better opportunity for you as a professional, but playing at such a high level as well. Like, how important was that period of time for you? Because it's like a trifecta there, isn't it? Club you love, exciting place to be because of the facilities and everything that's kind of going to benefit you as a professional. And you're playing in the elite women's level of football when you're like, what, 20, 21?
Yeah, looking back, it's surreal, really. I remember feeling really overwhelmed by, I think that game that you're talking about, I came on as a sub, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, am I going to get subbed on? And probably just being absolutely petrified on the pitch. I definitely didn't have, when I first went to Birmingham, for sure, I didn't really think too much of myself as a player, simply because I was around so many really, really good players. And I think because Blues at that time didn't necessarily have the clout to replace central defenders as they got injured or left, I believe I just kind of fell into that position and was had a lot of good fortune, and eventually managed to make that position my own. But definitely initially it was very surreal and probably quite overwhelming.
was looking through obviously the time you spent in Birmingham, which is a while, and it's difficult to narrow down into like little bits. There's so much stuff you can do. You've been named in the WSL Team of the Year 2017, 18, 19, 2 seasons in a row. Too hard for me to narrow it down, and it would probably be a podcast on its own. So I thought I'd just flip this a little bit. Your time at Birmingham was obviously special for a number of reasons, but if you could, what was your best memory of your time at Birmingham City?
The year that we went all the way to the FA Cup final in 2017, I think that was really, really special. And when I went from Birmingham to City, obviously that particular final in 2017 was against City. I went to City in the summer of 2019. It was only when I got to City that I realised that at Birmingham we should never have had a chance that day. And the resource and the infrastructure was basically absolutely nothing compared to what was on offer at a team like Man City. And so I find myself feeling even more proud looking back, that not that we were able to compete, but that we believed that we were able, because we didn't really have a right to compete in that league, really, compared to some of the other teams. So I've just mentioned City, but obviously there's the likes of Chelsea and your Arsenals at the time. United weren't around at that point. But believing like we had a real good chance and that we could beat any team on our day, that was a really special team. It was very much like a backs against the wall underdog feeling, that like every game you had to come out of the blocks absolutely firing on all cylinders to even have a chance of getting a result against the better teams. And that was something that I found so strange when I went from Blues to City, was that obviously City had such excellent players that although they would never act like this, they could afford to not necessarily be their best on a given day and still win, right? Because that's a testament to how good they were as players. And I must say that at every team I've played at, almost everyone is so competitive. But it was only really when I went to City that I realised just how much of the gulf was there between the teams. Like at that time, there was a clear top three: City, Chelsea, and Arsenal, and the rest. And so for it to be at Birmingham and to think that we could bridge that gap was quite special looking back.
I think then you obviously moved to City. Now I'm thinking about the time when you moved to City. I'm thinking about like where the women's game was at that point. Obviously, I think you had a great season, 2018-19, moved to City. Your signing was done at the Etihad Stadium. Your photos were taken at the Etihad Stadium. I think the first game was the Manchester Derby at the Etihad as well. Now, this is all coming off the back of the 2019 World Cup, which it elevated the game to a higher level. Obviously, the Euros just took it up a complete notch on top of that. But that's where, for me, it really started to, should we say, climb up the ladder a lot more and be a lot more noticeable. You were obviously at that point of a vastly experienced player because you've been playing for a number of years at that point. But in tandem with how big the game was becoming, like it must have felt like quite, not a surreal moment, but you must have felt like it was a very different summer, that summer, the way things that went. Can you just run me through those like opening weeks, what they were like for you at Man City, the signing being announced at the Etihad, the game in front of 31,000, obviously you're at a new club coming off the back of the World Cup, people are beginning to know the names of players, just little things like that changed so much in that summer, and for you it must have been a massive one.
That time between when I went to City and when I got injured in the middle of October, so I think that's a window of a few months. And I was also able to be involved with some of the Lioness squads, was just probably the most surreal part of any of the football that I've ever played. I remember that opening game at the Etihad against United, and I think there was around 30,000 people there. And I remember it being a really, really sunny day, and just being in absolute awe, and actually just shocked that many people had taken an interest in a women's game of football. And I was so overwhelmed by that feeling that I just had an absolute shocker in the first half, so much so that I changed my boots at half time thinking that would make a difference. And still to this day, I'll mention that game to Leah Galton, who I was marking on that day. And so those months of my life, that summer 2019 into autumn, every day was just like, wow. It was also the first time where I really started to like live on my own. I'd managed to go to uni, but I stayed at home with my parents. And so it was the first time moving out of the city that I grew up in. I was living on my own. I can't describe what it felt like to live that reality of really being a professional footballer in every sense of the word, because at Blues, even though we were punching so much above our weight, we weren't really fully integrated with the men's side. And so we didn't have access to things like video analysis rooms, and there wasn't food and stuff like that. But then obviously at City, where the facilities are incredible, you'd go and have breakfast, then video analysis, and it was almost like a factory production line of football and a schedule catered around a professional footballer. And it was just totally surreal, and matched with the increased interest at the time, which now looking back probably wasn't nearly as big as what we're starting to experience now. But it did feel like a very, I doubt I'll play a portion of football in my life again that felt as surreal and as special than that period.
That period of time, as you said, unfortunately, up in, I think it was the October, you said you got the first ACL. Don't want to touch on the negatives too much. We all know it's difficult, but I'm a friend with someone whose young daughter adores you. I think she sent you a video during lockdown of her just screaming your name and then saying, "I love you" at the end of it. So I said, is there anything you want me to ask Aoife specifically? The only time I'll give my questions away, but obviously they talked about your injury. I think it was 498 days to be precise. Look, that's a long process. But rather than focus on the negative, right? What she wanted me to ask you was, what was it that kept you motivated in that from day one to day 498 to come back the first time around, the first time you'd experienced that injury?
Well, that's a very good question for a kid to ask.
Better than any of them that I've asked, isn't it? Like she's 9 or something like that as well. Better than any question I put together, which is why I pinched it. So
I had a real belief, probably misplaced because I was quite young in my football career at that point, that this was just sort of almost like it was an inconvenience, and that once we got the inconvenience out of the way, I would sort of jump back onto the gravy train of really enjoying football. And as the months went on in that injury, it kind of started to become clearer and clearer that the rehab wasn't going as smoothly as I would have liked. COVID obviously happened through all of that, which is just the most strange time, like nothing that any of us have ever experienced before. And so when I finished my university at Blues, I was able to take a contract at Birmingham, which meant that, okay, I'm a full professional footballer now. I don't need to work. And so I was always quite academic, and my feeling was I was going to treat football as though it was my work, and that every day I would have like a certain amount of work to do in terms of training on the pitch and trying to do extras around that. And so I basically, I think, applied that mentality to when I was rehabbing. Like there was a task to do every day, and whether I liked it or not, if I wanted to give myself a chance of returning to football physically fit and capable, then I needed to get through the work that the trusted experts had set me on that given day. And I guess you just repeat and repeat and repeat, 1, 2, skip a few, and it's nearly 500 days later. So there wasn't any like massive like overarching mantra as such, but just that every day, had to sort of go through it really. And some days were actually really fun and a lot less down in the dumps than you'd think, but others were really difficult compared to the most recent rehab. And it's probably only when I've gone through this one that I've just come back from where I think wow, that first one was like an absolute humdinger. That was like all of your injuries that any player should have in their career in one injury, like in one injury experience. And so I was really lucky that I was able to spend a lot of time with my family because of COVID through that time. That probably took the burden off. But on the flip side of that, didn't get to see the physio, didn't get to see the S&C for months face to face. And so, yeah, that rehab was quite complicated. But overall, I just had a belief that to just sort of keep going, really.
There's so many things I could ask about, but I'm going to be holding you for about 4 hours if I did that. So I always start my podcast with the same question, which is, how's your day been? And I always have my final 2 questions. Now, I've got to be honest, I think they're great questions, which is why I keep them in. Every person I've spoke to probably finds them the hardest and hates them. That's why I've kept them. So the first one is the second hardest one, I think. But who's the toughest opponent you've ever came up against?
That is a great question. The toughest, I'll tell you just who sprung to my mind. I think if I thought about it too much, I probably taught myself into giving a different answer, or like thinking about it too much. But the first person that came into my mind was actually Caroline Weir.
I love Caroline Weir.
Yeah, and I say that because I remember coming back to fitness at City and trying to defend her. And we've already spoken about how the way I see the game is very competitive. It's very physical, like to make things a 1v1 and get stuck in. You can't do that with players who are 17 steps ahead in their brain. Players like that want you to come close to them so they can just sort of bop it around you, or if you vacate the space that you've went to them from, they will find a way that kind of punishes you for stepping out of that space. And there's not many players, or there's no one really that I can think of that I think does that as well as Caroline Weir. She, for me, is probably the first in my mind. People might think of others, but one of the first female players in the WSL that's played that true number 10 role. Obviously, City were iconic for that 4-3-3, the holding midfielder being Kira, and then kind of 2 other midfielders. And Caroline Weir was probably one of the first players that positionally played that position just so intelligently, and almost unplayable in like a 5v5 in training. So I definitely don't get my ego scratched whenever she's involved with anything, but she's an incredible player.
Yeah, we're huge fans. We're going over to Madrid to see you in a few weeks, so I'm really pleased you said that, actually. The final question might take a bit of thinking behind it, but I'll give you a couple of rules behind what the question entails.
Rules.
So there is rules to it, but they work in your favour, I think. So it's an ultimate 5-a-side team from players that you've only played alongside. Now, the rules are as follows. You can include yourself if you want to. That's absolutely fine. And you can have a goalkeeper, or you don't have to have a goalkeeper. You can play rush goalkeeper. It's completely up to you. The only real rule is there have to be players you've played alongside, and only 5 of them.
Okay. Great question. Wow. I would say I would have Alessia Russo in there. She was sort of I think she's like a bit of a stock choice. Like, there's nothing funky there. There's nothing that needs to be explained.
She's
talking about
good.
Someone who scored a back heel in the semi-final of the Euros. So I'd have her up there. I actually need to make another rule for myself, or else listeners won't find it that interesting. The other rule is not to have almost all the players as United players, because the second person that I thought of was Tooney. But I'm going to apply that rule to myself and say maybe just one United player, and Alessia Russo was that first person.
I like that rule.
Say that again.
I like that rule. Yeah. I might apply that for. Yeah, I'm keeping it.
Well, I mean, it's only hard if you feel like you play in a team that has incredible players.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, it's definitely made it hard for me. because of the girls that I play alongside with. But Alessia Russo, I'd have Caroline Weir. I'd definitely have Kira Walsh. And then we need some sort of fullback option. Obviously, we have to know that I've given myself that rule, so I can't pick on her. The natural option is then Lucy Bronze. She's probably been a bit of a, like, someone that I've really looked up to in my career. Someone that is, achieved so much for myself that I really, really respect her. She became popular as a sort of a household name before everything that's happened in the summer, with the girls winning the Euros. And so she's one of those few players that has managed to sort of transcend just being a women's footballer. She's sort of became a bit of an icon, really. So I have to have her. I think that leaves me one more player. So I am going to say maybe a bit of a curveball because they're not currently playing, but I'm going to say maybe Kaz Carney.
Yeah.
Because, again, another person that doesn't need to be explained. She was obviously another icon of mine at Birmingham and has gone on to amazing things in the world of punditry and commentary. So definitely someone that I look up to on the pitch, but more recently, obviously, off it as well.
Not a bad team, and you're only the second guest out of about 15 that hasn't chose yourself. So you're in a small band of people, but I genuinely mean that when I'm saying I absolutely loved that chat. I just hope that you did as well. I hope you had as much fun as I did.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was really fun.
Absolute pleasure.